Hi guys, today we're going to talk about the progressive age presidents. This lecture is particularly important because this is the week where we start doing that extra 15 minutes of homework. So this week it's going to be a short answer question that has a political cartoon. And for that political cartoon, you guys are going to be analyzing Teddy Roosevelt. So it is important that you kind of go through the background reading on him before you actually do that question. And this will be part of helping you for that. So it's just part of a continued effort to make sure that we're practicing the skills that we need and the components that we need for the AP exam in May. We are going to start with a little bit of background. So during this time period, we have that increase in trusts or monopolies that are built up during the Gilded Age, these super large corporations that control huge sections of the economy. They do this through vertical and horizontal integration. This is review from December. The whole idea of this is by forming a monopoly, you gain all of the profits for that particular industry, and that's what people like Rockefeller were doing, and even people like Carnegie. In these particular examples, a trust is just one way to organize a monopoly. So you can use the terms pretty interchangeably during this time period. Because the government had a policy, an economic and political policy called laissez-faire economics, for the most part, businesses were allowed to grow completely unchecked during this time period. The government kept its hands off of the economy and therefore didn't regulate a lot of these businesses, allowing them to grow to enormous sizes and to treat their workers, in all honesty, rather horribly. And when the government was called upon to intervene, they often took the side of industrialists in an effort to, as they put it, not interfere with the free market. But this included things like putting down strikes and upholding trusts' rights over workers' rights. Um, while there was some kickback to this, specifically in 1890 with the Sherman Antitrust Act, most of that was fairly ineffective. One of the major reasons that the Sherman Antitrust Act was so ineffective is that it was very difficult to enforce. During the time period throughout the 1890s, the Supreme Court actually ruled against a lot of the action taken by the government, which made it very difficult for them to enforce the Sherman Antitrust Law. And as a consequence of that interference, the government stopped using it for quite a while. And so you still have a period where there is an antitrust law on the books, but it's not really being enforced. That will start to change in the 1900s because as we get into the 1900s, the makeup of the Supreme Court is also going to change, and they're going to start siding in favor of the Sherman Antitrust Act and of the government. We have three progressive age presidents. Two of them are Republican, so Teddy Roosevelt and Taft, and one of them is a Democrat, Wilson. Throughout this time period, please remember with Roosevelt, there are two presidents by the name of Roosevelt. You do need to distinguish between them. So when you write about Roosevelt during this time period, please just write T. Roosevelt so that we know that that's who you are referring to. It's usually obvious in context, but just to be safe. Teddy Roosevelt is actually a progressive Republican. So consider the Republicans who were in power during Reconstruction. Those were considered progressive or radical Republicans. Teddy Roosevelt is like that. So he has this belief that government has a place in society and that it has a regulatory position. And he was actually very powerful within his own state as the New York governor. While he was governor, in New York, he was able to push forth civil service reform. So he's attacking political machines. He started to tax corporations. He was not practicing laissez faire economics. And because of his progressiveness, it made him very unpopular with more conservative Republicans who were more business minded. And so, what they did in an effort to essentially stifle his popularity and prevent him from gaining some of the top positions is they made him vice president. In which you may go, why would you make him vice president if you don't want him to be that powerful? Well, traditionally, the stepping stone to the presidency isn't the vice presidency, it's actually the Secretary of State. For the most part, vice presidents are only as active as the presidents want them to be. So you can have a vice president that's very inactive. They have this prestigious title, but they don't really have any power unless the president gives them power. And so he was chosen as vice president because it's seen as this dead end job in national politics. Like, where do you go except the presidency from vice president? And how often does that happen? So the goal was to actually prevent his career from going any further because he was as high as he could possibly get. But then McKinley got assassinated, like a month into his presidency, and all of a sudden, the one person they didn't want to be president was president. It didn't really work out for them. So, when we're going through his policies, he's kind of the president that wasn't meant to be, and he ends up being extremely popular. So, despite being in this dead end vice presidency position, all of a sudden he is in the presidency position where he gets to influence what politics are going to be like, and he does tremendously. He is very much a capitalist. So I do want you to think about this in terms of the progressives can often come off as socialistic. He's not. Just because they are progressives doesn't mean they're socialists. Like, there are socialist progressives. He's not one of them. So he very much believes in private property, but he doesn't believe in laissez faire economics necessarily. So the example for this is in 1902, the coal workers go on strike. So, much like previous strikes in the railroad industry and the steel industry, this is a really important industry in America. If the coal workers go on strike, you have a situation where eventually people might start freezing to death. Like, you need coal because it's how people heat their houses, it's how trains get around the country. This is a really important industry in America. And when the coal workers go on strike, the expectation is that, much like in previous strikes, like Pullman or the Great Railroad Strike in 1877, the government will send in troops to send them back to work. And that's not what Roosevelt does at all. Instead, he calls upon labor leaders and the leaders of the coal working company to come to the Capitol to negotiate. And when the owners of the coal industry refuse to negotiate, he threatens to nationalize them, to essentially take their company away from them because they're not in compliance with the Sherman antitrust law. And so that forces them into a position where they eventually actually do negotiate with their employees. And he sets a precedent that he's not going to be like Gilded Age presidents. He's not completely on their side. Yes, he is a capitalist, but he's not a laissez faire president. He wanted enforcement of both the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Interstate Commerce Act, which would allow him to regulate businesses that cross state lines, which was a lot of the bigger businesses. In doing this, he also created what was called the Bureau of Corporations, which was designed to be a sub-department of the Justice Department. And the whole point of that Bureau of Corporations was to enforce those laws. So those laws were the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Interstate Commerce Act. And it is that particular subset of the Justice Department that actually files lawsuits against the Northern Securities Company, which is a railroad company, which ultimately resulted in the Supreme Court dissolving their company because they were in violation of antitrust laws. So, unlike the Gilded Age, where the Supreme Court did not side in favor of the government, they sided in favor of the companies, now that's starting to flip. Because remember, the Supreme Court changes slowly, as presidents change slowly, and you get new appointments over time because they have lifelong appointments. So the judges are slowly becoming more progressive, and that is changing the way that they rule on the Sherman antitrust law. What I want to do with you guys for this section is I want to talk about a political cartoon and kind of analyze it in class so that when you go to do it on the homework, it makes a little bit more sense. So we're going to start by talking about the components of this particular political cartoon. First and foremost, you'll notice at the bottom it says Jack and the Wall Street Giants, which immediately means that we have an allegory that we're looking at Jack and the Beanstalk. So we have the giants who are all monopolists. You see Morgan, J.J. Hill, Jay Gould, Oxnard, and Rockefeller. They're all labeled on their clothing. They're all carrying these huge bludgers. So you have the one in the front that says like merger and the other one that says something finance, sorry. And then you have Teddy Roosevelt, who is represented in the front, who is always represented very muscular, which we'll talk about in the next unit. But he is wielding the sword of public service, which is the government. And so you get this imagery of this tiny little hero going up against the giants. But if we base this on the allegory of Jack and the Beanstalk, we know he's going to win because that's what happens in the story. So it sets up this imagery in our mind that we have this tiny hero who is about to go toe to toe with these giants and beat them. The other components that we want to consider, this isn't on here. This was produced in Puck magazine, so Puck magazine was very progressive throughout this period, and a lot of our cartoons actually come from this particular magazine. It also was produced in 1904, right after Teddy Roosevelt had been legitimately elected president for his second term. So remember, he kind of lucks into his first term. I guess you would call it lucking into. I don't know if you could call it that if the president dies, but he wasn't voted into office. The second time he's voted into office, and that had just happened. So this is riding on the popularity that he carries through with him. You know, on the exams, when we're talking about the SAC, one of the main questions you get asked is, what is the perspective being expressed in this image? Well, if we're looking at this particular piece, just based on the fact that these giants have these spiked maces, he's not welcome. Roosevelt is not welcome. They're very aggressive towards him and by proxy also the government. And so this is this establishment that the giants who rule America, the corporations and the people who own them, want to kind of beat government down and keep them tiny. But because of the allegory, we know that there is this perspective that government's going to win. And we're rooting for the government as the hero in this story. So the perspective is very critical of the big businesses. It's very supportive of FDR and his ability to tackle these giant problems, literally giant problems, that are plaguing the nation. If we look at causes and effect, because that's another thing that gets brought up in this time period, please remember if they ask you what causes the sentiment in this particular photograph, what you're looking at is a situation where you need to talk about laissez-faire economics that led to these large corporations existing in the first place. Like, how do these giants get to be so giant? Laissez-faire economics. A failure to enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act. Those are all parts of causes that lead to this particular perspective. Why is the government so small? Well, because they've been very inactive. When we look at effects, we're actually going to flip to the next slide for that. One of the things that Teddy Roosevelt does in his effort to take those giants down is he passes a new law called the Hepburn Act. And what that is designed to do is strengthen the Interstate Commerce Act and the ability of the government to oversee the trusts who are failing to comply. One of the key things with this, and I cannot stress this enough how important this is this week for you, is that there is a huge distinction made in terms of trusts that are restrained versus trusts that are unrestrained. So, good trusts versus bad trusts. So, if you are acting in good faith, so it's called the good faith clause, what that means is that maybe you are not price fixing. You're not conducting hostile takeovers of other companies. Yes, you have become a very large corporation. If you don't throw that weight around to try and control the economy and to try and take advantage of people, if you are acting in good faith like that, you will continue to exist. If you start to act in bad faith, if you're unrestrained and you start to charge too much money for products that people need, or you start to be very aggressive towards other companies, then you are not in good faith and you will be taken out by things like the Hepburn Act or the Interstate Commerce Act. When the second term for Teddy Roosevelt comes to an end, his vice president and his protege, William Howard Taft, comes into office. For the sake of our class for today, the main thing that you need to know about Taft is that he basically just continues Roosevelt's policies. So by and large, he doesn't really do anything new or revolutionary. In fact, he's very controversial, which you'll see in your AMSCO questions this week if you haven't already. Um, he's unfortunately a less charismatic, less well liked Taft or Roosevelt. And so he's kind of more of the same, which means we do see a continuation of the progressive period while he's in office. But he's just not that influential. So he's kind of a holding pattern president. Which brings us to the third and final progressive president, which is Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is a Democrat. He is president from 1913 to 1921, which does mean that we're going to talk about him again because he is president during World War I, which means you might have actually heard of him last year from Wilson's 14 points. We're going to talk about him as a domestic president today. So what does he do at home, not what does he do in Europe during World War I? The main goal for President Wilson during this time period is to ensure that competition exists, that second bullet point. He wants to make sure that trusts aren't just acting in good faith, that there's real competition in the market because that's what capitalism requires, is a lot of competition. And so he's not as okay with these good trusts, so to speak, as Roosevelt or Taft were. He really doesn't want any trusts to exist because that is anti-competitive. And so to that end, he actually passes the Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914 that further defines and strengthens the Sherman Antitrust Act. And what it does is it allowed the government to preemptively regulate trusts. So in order for you to get tried, essentially, with the Sherman Antitrust Act, you already have to be a monopoly. Like, it's very reactionary. You can only go after companies that are already monopolies and then break them apart if they become into violation. Whereas Wilson argues trust should never be allowed to exist in the first place. We should be able to cut that off before it starts. And so with the Clayton Antitrust Act, what it did is it allowed the government more power to oversee mergers before they happened. So if you're a very large company and you control a huge portion of the market and you want to buy another company that also controls a large portion of the market, you would actually have to ask the government for permission to do that beforehand so that they can analyze what impact that will have on competition and therefore what impact that will have on consumers. And so it is preemptively cutting off trusts from happening before they can become damaging to society. And they did this by sending cease and desist orders against anti-competitive practices and monitoring mergers before they happened. So, when we're comparing Wilson and Roosevelt, one of the major differences is their stance on when a monopoly should be taken down. Roosevelt essentially argued that because of the free market, a monopoly might be allowed to exist, but if they started acting in bad faith, then they should be separated. Whereas Wilson essentially argued that trusts are pretty much always bad and should never exist in the first place. And so he wanted to cut them off before they actually started. And part of this is a difference in time. Roosevelt is very early in the progressive movement, whereas Wilson is right at the end. People are a lot more accepting of government intervention by the time Wilson comes into office as opposed to Roosevelt. But that's kind of the main difference between them. Wilson is a lot more focused on how trusts affect people and the population, whereas Roosevelt is a lot more focused on how trusts impact the economy as a whole. And that partially comes from their party backgrounds, with Roosevelt being a Republican and Wilson being a Democrat. All right, guys, that is it for today. So you need to wrap up the questions. If you finish those questions early, then you need to move on to working on your AMSCO 21. I would focus on the Roosevelt questions before you actually do the short answer question for the week, the 15-minute short answer question. All right. Thank you guys, and I will see first period tomorrow and fourth and fifth period on Wednesday. Bye, guys.